What's up, Uncoverers, and welcome to the third live stream of Fawley Power Station, where we'll be looking at the leaked documents from the UK Office of Artificial Intelligence. Just to pick up where we left off, on your screen now is a diagram illustrating the process of flushing, the process that we had discussed in the previous video with the agents Asimov and Aki, flushing water in one end, cleaning the contaminated soil, and then extracting this liquid from the other end. This liquid can then be recycled. Jumping back into the leaked document, this is the third part, the third of 4. So we can see here there's some kind of what looks like blueprints. There's a series of these blueprints that are sketching out a series of system diagrams by the looks of it. And what's interesting is we can see here this first one is called agent ecology. So I think this starts to give us an idea of how Asimov and Aki actually work together and how they flush. So we can see here contaminated soil, it's excavated, the hydro flushing. So Asimov obviously seems to carry out the first part, and then Aki is deployed and then carries out the second part. So there's a symbiosis between the agents as well as between the humans and the agents. And then we see here on this page synthetic remediation system. So we can see here a part of the SRS, this synthetic remediation system, is to deploy the agents Asimov and Aki. So when they've collected this contaminated water / oil mix, they seem to feed this back into the synthetic remediation system. Once oil deposit within SRS has reached 80% of capacity, the first stage of conversion process. So so we're getting an idea here. So it's evidently responsible for collecting the crude oil, the waste crude oil that the agents have collected from the site, and then converting it, ultimately it says here, into PTFE. And then interestingly at the bottom here it says remediated land facilitates a tax break and financial incentives under new waste directive. So the incentive for the UKI to remediate the site is, I guess, to promote remediation through artificial intelligence. So we see here the synthetic remediation system is turning the crude oil waste into ultimately profit for whoever uses it. I'm not quite sure who is designed to use it at the moment, but we can see here waste oil to synthetic plastic. So this is the actual process of turning waste oil into what looks like naphtha here. So the waste oil is filtered, distilled, boiled and separated into naphtha, which can then be sold as a raw material, or naphtha can then be fed through a steam cracker, and then the steam cracker feeds into an extruder, which subsequently creates PTFE. So interestingly, you can effectively turn waste crude oil recovered from the site into plastic or other saleable raw materials. And on this page here we see very clearly a manifesto provided by the Office for Artificial. I haven't seen this released, perhaps this is yet to be released, but we can see there's a large focus on public engagement and seemingly communicating AI with the public, and perhaps this is part of the larger master plan here, is the overall communication and connection and bridging the gap between humans and AI. We can see here they're looking at methods of conversing with AI, teaching the British public perhaps. So this is where it starts to get really quite curious. So we can see the point cloud for Fawley Power Station that we had discussed before, but overlaid is a set of what seems to be drivers. And we see in the top left corner here, you see there's inputs, outputs varying from water, prevailing wind. So it seems like these are existing outputs on the site as it was post demolition, so just with the foundations and then the environmental drivers. And then what's interesting here, so you can see there's a section here that seems to be sitting directly in front of this kind of oil contamination. And so what they've done is taken that, so we can see here there's that point cloud section, this orange section here, they've taken that and they've used a meshing process here that seems very similar to that we saw on the chimney, and they've applied the same drivers that we saw on the previous page, but more specifically to this smaller section. And then this page begins to explain to us exactly what they're doing with this information. So we see here the 2017 point cloud data pre-demolition, the drivers that we had discussed post-demolition. There's a set of required spaces, and then there's a set of parameters for these spaces. We can see here these 3 elements are then fed into a creative algorithm. So you're telling an artificial intelligence, basically, this is the space I have, these are the drivers that need to be taken into account, and then these are the spaces that are required within the space that it's been fed. And then so we can see there's a little excerpt. I wonder if we can actually get a glance at the code itself. If we look here, we can actually see an excerpt from the creative algorithm itself. I'm not a coder, so I'm not one to pick this apart, but it's interesting that they're using this kind of machine learning process to effectively seemingly design a set of spaces utilizing existing drivers on site. So the creative algorithm interprets these spaces and chucks out a set of parameters, and then Python and Blender seemingly interpret these parameters, and then these 3D forms are generated and human input plays a part. So it's seemingly a very AI-centric design process with a touch of human input at the end. And then we can see here the kind of the final output from these. So that was the original point cloud that we saw here, interpreted as a mesh. So then that mesh point cloud has been seemingly translated into 3 suggestions as to what these 3 spaces could be. The 3 spaces control centre, factory and synthetic nursery. You know, a factory and a nursery to build something and then to train it, perhaps, and perhaps they're building agents, you know, the likes of Marvin, Aki and Asimov. So what's interesting is we can see the suggestions, and then there's a constellation that's been selected through human input. So although it is a very AI-centric design process, there is still a touch of symbiosis. Yeah, the colours are quite curious. Oh, we just had a donation. Toby Hood, thank you for the £5, he just said AI only design scary. Yeah, it is quite, it's unnerving stuff. It's definitely it's cutting edge, I guess you'd say. As I mentioned, there is still a small human input, so yeah, I guess we'll see this might be the future. It's interesting, they're looking at kind of AI generated images and then seemingly how they can turn into an AI suggestion of materiality, perhaps. Yeah, so this is really interesting stuff, Uncoverers, because this is the first time we see the kind of research placed on site post demolition. So we can see those kind of AI generated spatial interpretation. They're actually being suspended here within, I think, what could only be described as a hangar. This large hangar with an extensive array of cabling, which would suggest is perhaps adaptable, transformable. The nature of AI leaves opportunity for a lot of growth, so perhaps they've had to leave it open-ended and allow for a certain amount of transformability within the structure itself. That would explain the kind of pulley systems. Yeah, so it's interesting. This seems to be an AI-only designed set of spaces, and then now suspended within this hangar structure. And then we can just see here in this exploded diagram just a quick breakdown of the hangar sitting above the blobs, and then all of that mounted to the existing kind of foundations within Fawley Power Station. Yeah, I'm not sure about you guys, but these images quite excite me because I feel like it's the first time we can see what the physical manifestation of this previous research might actually start to look like on site. These blobs look pretty interesting to me. It must be an incredible experience to be within one. And interestingly, the AI-driven design processes don't stop there. So they've taken the three blobs, those three spatial interpretations, and they've taken this middle one, which was the factory, I believe. And then this factory, they've split it into two main floor plates, and they've split it into the engine room and the assembly hall. So that's given them two sets of parameters to work within. And then so we can see here the engine room on the right and the assembly hall on the left, and seemingly similar to the previous point cloud process, there's a set of drivers. It seems to be some form of intakes on the outside edge, and then some capture system on the top there. And then we can see on this image on the right, there's inputs and outputs through these kind of holes. Yeah, if we go back to this image, we can see these kind of spindly tentacles almost hanging from the underside, so perhaps that's what those holes represent. And then we can see here, so this was the engine room from that previous design, but this large kind of set of code. So it seems that they've used a similar process to the blobs, using AI machine learning to generate a suggestion of how the space should be laid out. And here we can actually see the manifestation of that suggestion. So the fuel inputs are here, the waste in that back corner. So this whole space has effectively been designed by AI, you know, from the outer skin through to the internal, using the same process as the engine room, kind of this creative algorithm, but again we can see a different set of spaces down here. So instead of waste store, etc., we're looking at fuel stomach, loading bay, agent output. Okay, so agent output's an interesting one, because that makes it obvious that this assembly hall is an assembly line, at least initially intended for agents to help create these. Then we can see here what it looks like further AI interpretation of how the assembly kind of line structure would sit, and then the kind of output from that interpretation, which is really interesting stuff. And I think this image does a really nice job of just summarizing what we've been looking at. So we can see the middle blob, as we discussed, the factory, and then this set of internals that have been generated through AI driven processes. This kind of strange structure we see is effectively an AI suggestion or interpretation of how a factory would be laid out, including the engine room and the assembly line, which is really curious stuff, and I don't think a human would have laid out a factory that would look anything like this. So in those circuit diagrams that we looked at earlier on in this leaked document, we saw mention of a synthetic remediation system, and it seems like this is actually that structure itself. So we can see here at the bottom there's an oil capture unit and an agent maintenance bay, which is this, evidently this section here, and then filtration bladders. So these seem to run this kind of frame, this long frame that kind of runs up. We can see three of them, as so the oil is captured in here, the agents deposit the oil water mixture, and it's then filtered through here into this structure here, distillation unit. So the oil and water mixture is distilled in this unit here, and then so in this pan here we have naphtha, which can either be steam cracked and extruded into PTFE or sold by itself as a saleable product. So this synthetic remediation system is evidently responsible for turning contaminated crude oil into either plastic or a saleable product through the assistance of these agents. Asimov and Aki are responsible seemingly for this kind of autonomous process, which then connects into this synthetic remediation system. And this image just gives us a sense of perspective, how large the kind of AI hangar there is in the background with the blobs within. And then on the right here we can see these kind of mud piles, which are presumably the remnants left behind the excavation process that Asimov undertakes. And then so what's really interesting about this page here is we see PG range and available now. So it's obvious that this SRS is going to be some form of saleable product. Presumably landowners can use it to remediate contaminated land if they happen to have instances of contamination. I think it's something like 70% of British ground is in some form contaminated, so it would explain as to why you'd want to have this structure that you could deploy on site and remediate the site. Presumably that remediation would also bring tax incentives and benefits with that new kind of waste directive that we discussed in the previous circuit diagrams. Exceller248 in chat has mentioned that there seems to be a variety of setup. Yeah, I think you're right. If we look in at the bottom right here, we can see, so this looks like it almost is, so you're set within the foundations of the basement, so this is the kind of Fawley setup. But then in the lighter, in the background there, we can see another setup which presumably would be suitable for flat ground. Presumably that is the setup that we utilised on a kind of normal field site as pictured above here. So looking again at machine learning AI and kind of spatial interpretations and suggestions, we can see here we're looking at the full Fawley Power Station foundations. If we look at the bottom left here, I think we can actually see the different spaces. Yeah, so we can see here plug, public education centre, synthetic remediation system, financial sector and artificial hangar, which explains, as well as providing testing beds, to test different forms of AI through the artificial hangar, which was AI centric, and the synthetic remediation system, which is kind of symbiotic with autonomous agents and humans. The public education centres seems to serve as kind of the communication of AI towards the general public, as opposed to, so it's not only a testing bed for the AI, it's also a method of communication between AI and the general public. Yeah, and then on this last page here we can see the set of suggestions from the machine learning algorithm overlaid over each other there, and then presumably there'll be some form of human input similar to the blobs, kind of a constellation, or pick the best suggestion based on human understanding of the site and its limitations. Well, thanks Uncoverers for joining me for the third of these live streams. Join me next Monday at 8 PM for the last of the series. We've seen a variety of different AI applications and techniques utilised within this site. Don't forget to like, subscribe and join me next Monday for the last of the series. Thanks guys.